Thanks for joining with us today for a special seminar by Dr. Ujjwal Gadraju. He's coming all the way from the Netherlands, kindly visiting us. I'll give a brief overview about Ujjwal. He's got a pretty long bio, but I'm going to read a short part of it. So Ujjwal is an assistant professor at the Web Information Systems group of the Software Technology Department at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He's a director of the Delft AI Design at Scale Lab, which focuses on human AI collaboration to design solutions for complex social problems. Ujjwal leads a research line on crowd computing and human-centered AI at the WIS group. He's also an AC distinguished speaker, and he has published his work at premier venues like CHI, CSCW, and many other leading venues. And also he has been recognized with various honors, including the Best Paper Award at top tier HCI and AI conferences. So I'll hand over to Ujjwal for this talk, and thanks again for joining with us.
Well, thank you so much, Ninola. Thanks everyone for coming here. All right, on cue, so time to leave. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. It's been a few years now since I think last sat in a room with Mark and with Damiano. I've been meaning to share the same space with Danula, and it's finally happening. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for showing up, everyone. And thank you for those kind words as well, Danula. We're here to talk about effective human AI decision making today, and I hope to share some interesting thoughts that we've been gathering over the last few years in this space. And hopefully this will lead to a lot of fun discussions through the course of this evening. Danula has already done a fine job of telling you all what I tend to do every now and again. There we go. I'd like to position my research and the work we do in the space of trying to build better AI systems, right? And I like to think of this as what's the human quotient and what can we as humans do to help create better systems, AI systems that we can then use, right? And I like to think of it from the standpoint of computational roles that humans can play. You can think of this as AI that can be improved via human input. And I also like to think of this from the standpoint of the interactional role that humans tend to play with AI systems and what we can learn through those interactions to then build better AI systems in turn, right? So that's essentially the playing field that I try to operate on. I'm quite interested in conversational interfaces and what conversational agents and interactions can add to this particular context where HCI meets AI and humans tend to interact with AI systems with an increasing amount of regularity these days. And well, I have a foot in the interactive information retrieval space. It's a field I was relatively more active in during the course of my PhD and postdoc years. So every now and again, you'll see me dabble in that space as well. And while I've spoken to some of you today, and I know that we share a few common grounds and interests in the space of XAI. That being said, let me walk us through an unusual beginning. But before I do that, I'll also say that a lot of the work that's been done in the past is thanks to a lot of amazing collaborators and students who are a part of our group, and many others who aren't on this slide, but are equal contributors in many of the things I'll talk about today. And now that promised detour and unusual beginning, I'll walk you through a little anecdote from Greek mythology, right? So some of us here have probably come across Sisyphus. Who knows who Sisyphus is? Some of us do, some of us don't. So I'll walk us through this little anecdote if I find a way to get my clicker going. So Sisyphus was the founder of a place called Ephyra, right? And this is present day Corinth. Sisyphus was also at the other end of a very famous punishment. So for those of you who are familiar with Hades, who is the god of death and also the king of the underworld, he had an unfortunate, or at least from the standpoint of Sisyphus's existence, an encounter with Sisyphus. So Sisyphus apparently cheated death twice. How exactly did he do it? Why did he do it? That's for you to unearth later on this evening at your own time. But the point is that Hades eventually punished him for cheating death twice. And what was his punishment? It's an image that all of us have probably come across at some point in time or another, right? The punishment that was meted out was that Sisyphus had to carry this gigantic boulder up a hill And each time he just about made it, the boulder would start rolling all the way back down. And he was punished to do this for the rest of his existence, right? For eternity. Now, hold that thought at the back of your heads, and we'll come back to it at some point later this evening. Several millennia later, we're in present day Melbourne, where technology has been ravaging our realities with a fierce amount of conviction, right? So we've seen that there have been revolutions in the last decade or so across several domains. I know some of us are dabbling in the context of transportation, health, finance, there's education, manufacturing, you name it. There've been a lot of revolutions in the recent past, right? And this disruption most recently has also come through the proliferation of large language models. I'm sure a lot of us have been operating along these lines, and have also been trying to understand how this would disrupt maybe a lot of the research we're currently doing, right? For those of you who are uninitiated, ChatGPT and GPT-4 has now been shown to be as good as humans in a lot of difficult tasks. Things like the GRE writing, vocabulary, LSATs, right? It's placing in high percentiles that you'll actually associate with humans and outperforming certain humans, right? And in all of that context, well, and here's a little tweet I plugged out from the co-founder of OpenAI, Greg Brockman. And this was, I think, about 5 hours after they announced that GPT-4 was out and people could access it. So that's just goes to show how rapidly things are evolving, right? People are already after GPT-5, and just earlier this morning, I learned about plugins that can be integrated along with GPT-4 to do a lot of marvelous, unthinkable things, right? But all of that can potentially be misused, right? And much like history bears a lot of important lessons, I'd argue that AI is equally a double-edged sword. And I think many of us, because of the nature of work we're doing and the conversations I've had with you all through the course of today, I think agree with this fact that AI can be put to a lot of different nefarious ends if used irresponsibly, right? So it's also a lot of responsibility that comes alongside our own roles when we try to research this area and come up with better ways of augmenting human lives. Now, let's take a historical perspective on this very point, right? The cost that is concomitant with a lot of technological advances is often a crippling cost, right? And I'll try to make that case by walking through a few examples. Let's think about the benefits that we as the human species have been able to enjoy across centuries thanks to technological advances. I think if you think about the energy sector in particular, there've been certain points in time where you could see and tell, well, this is exactly a point where the game changed, right? When you think about the energy sector, the invention of the steam engine was probably one of those first points. And then came, perhaps the internal combustion engine at some point, and then the jet engine, right? And along the way, there was the turboprop engine, all kinds of innovations that led to us being able to disrupt the energy sector and benefit in unimaginable ways, right? We also saw the expansion of food production thanks to industrial agriculture. That meant more people could produce more food, and more people could, consume more food and live more comfortably. There was a decline in infectious diseases, which then meant there was an increase in life expectancy across the world. But all of this also came at a lot of costs, right? Climate change perhaps is the most emphatic of all of those. I don't have to, articulate that point to greater depth. We've seen that there's been an increase in the extinction rate of species all around the world. We're in Australia right now, and we know that the coral reefs are, probably at some point in time, maybe even within our lifetime, is going to become a thing of legend, right? There's been a negative impact of industrial agriculture as well. We've also seen that there's an increase in proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and casualties thanks to war. We're living those realities right now. While all of that's happening, we're also constantly consuming headlines along these lines where AI is probably going to destroy all of us and we're going to be ruled over by AI. Will a robot steal your jobs? One of those conversations that's taking place across the globe in different corners, right? And these narratives, I'll argue, are quite overstated, sometimes very clickbaity and scientifically ridiculous, but they are taking place in the context that we live in, right? And it's a seesaw of these extremes. This whole narrative is a seesaw between, is this a dazzling future that we're going to wake up to, or is this going to be an absolute nightmare, right? And the middle point which rejects these two extremities when it comes to the narrative is this perspective of human-centered AI, right? Where you want to try and build AI systems that don't just serve a mundane purpose, that don't exist for the sake of existence, but are truly serving the purpose that humans need, right? So are you building a system that can augment a human while this person's completing a task? Are you amplifying the abilities that humans already have? Right? Are you trying to empower people by providing them the agency to improve the experiences that they're indulging in? Right? And that perspective is human-centered AI, and that's the axis along which I'd like to extend the conversation for the rest of this talk. And Ben Schneiderman's one of those pioneers of this perspective who's brought this to the fore and tried to articulate this in many meaningful ways. I'd like to give you a peek into some of this. You may have seen this before, but Ben Schneiderman talked about how it's important to think about human values before you begin to build systems, right? If you're building an AI system to solve a particular problem, what exactly is this going to do with respect to the human values, the rights that humans and users of these systems potentially have? What about constructive justice and dignity, right? What about the individual goals that people who are using the system might potentially have? Is there any unintended consequence to the amount of creativity, responsibility, self-efficacy, things like that, that might change as a result of this particular system that you might be building? What about the design aspirations? Is this going to be reliable? Is this robust across contexts? Is this trustworthy? Is this safe? Right? I'm sure a lot of us are using these words and this vocabulary to describe the solutions and systems we're building these days. But while we're thinking about all of this, it's also extremely important to think about the stakeholders, right? And your stakeholders could be us researchers, developers of systems, could be business leaders, policymakers, right? And end users. And I heard from one or two of you today, you're also interested in not just the direct stakeholders, but stakeholders who are indirectly affected by some of these things, right? It's valuable to think about all of that. Because in that very conversation, there are a lot of threats as well, right? That you might discover, that you might not plan for, but encounter along the way. Essentially, what's happening every morning you wake up to news, right? You realize that, hey, this is an unintended consequence no one thought about, but hey, here you go, right? ChatGPT, GPT-4, for example, it was in the news for some nefarious thing that they discovered where I think it was the headlines that were present in emails, or I don't quite know, I didn't read that story well enough, but there's constantly something or the other that developers of systems discover after deployment, right? That's not a situation you want to be in, especially if a large group of people can be affected negatively because of that. So what are the threats? What are the malicious actors who could potentially benefit from creating such technologies? What are the biases that can get propagated because of this? What are the potential flaws in systems and machines and softwares that propagate, right? Valuable questions to think about as my Microsoft Excel thing gets verified. And we had the pleasure of having Ben Schneiderman over at the Academic Fringe Festival, one of these initiatives we started at the stroke of the pandemic. And if you'd like to hear more, do tune into a conversation that we had with him on this particular website of the Academic Fringe Festival. Right, so something else I'd like to articulate before I dive into some of the things we've been doing is the balancing act of human control. Now, when you're trying to build AI systems that humans can potentially benefit from and can interact with to solve a particular task, it's also important to think about the axis of control, right? Now, when you think about the level of automation on an axis and the other axis being the amount of autonomy you're empowering the user with, where exactly would the technology you're building fall, right, on this axis? A simple way to think about this is to break this down into 4 quadrants. Now, imagine the quadrant over here on the top right-hand side has a high amount of automation and a high amount of human control. A good example that Ben brought up in his book was the digital camera, right? Now, a digital camera is a sophisticated piece of equipment, right? If you're someone who's quite keen on using it to its full potential, you can dive deep into setting up the ISOs and everything else that flies straight over my head, because I'm not someone who's really, that's not my field of expertise, I'll probably just point in the right direction and click. But there are others who can use it to the full potential, and that gives you an awful amount of human control, right? If you so desire. And much can be said about a vacuum cleaner as well, right? We have all kinds of robots that have increasingly been used during the pandemic as well. And they're quite sophisticated, but they're also highly configurable, right? You can tell your Roomba to clean specific rooms, not to go into other areas. You can help it map things that you want it to. So there's a fair degree of human control there. What about places where there's very low automation, but a high amount of human control? Things like your manual musical instruments, right? There's not a lot of automation there, but there's a high level of human control. Think about things where there's a lot of automation, but very little human control. And you can argue that's a desirable feature, right? Now, a pacemaker, you don't want to have a lot of control over that. Why? Because human error. Human error is extremely costly if it can kill you, right? So pacemaker is perhaps by design one of those examples where you don't want to have a lot of automation. Same thing goes with an airbag, right? You want your airbag to come into play when you need it in times of strife. You probably don't have time for human control to come into play there. And you have examples with, we're probably not going to build technology for in that space where there is low amount of human control, low amount of automation. But you might come up with examples where your systems would fall in that bracket as well, right? But I think for the most part, the difficult design choices we might have to articulate would probably fall into these quadrants where you're trying to balance out, should I have greater human control? Should I have greater human control, or should I have greater automation? What's the sweet spot? And you could also argue that having excessive human control is not something that's desirable, that it might not lead to the greatest user experience, right? And in the same breath, having excessive automation could also be equally risky, right? You want to be able to have humans jump in and identify correct flaws that you may not have thought about before, right? If history is telling us anything, it's that it's very difficult to design and build systems that are absolutely right all the time. You might be right most of the time, but it sort of again depends on what kinds of systems you're building. But if they're systems that evolve or rely on dynamic mechanisms, then you should be very careful not to just associate that with a constant level of performance, right? Because users also change, evolve over time. It's a constantly evolving ecosystem, right? That being said, and understanding that this is quite a difficult balancing act, let's also look at what are the non-functional requirements. If you're an HCI person and you're trying to understand what are the functional requirements and non-functional requirements of the systems that you're building, you can think of these as some of the non-functional requirements, right? You want your systems to be trustworthy, reliable, explainable, safe, unbiased, robust, fair, secure. A lot of other adjectives have been thrown into these discussions across the board. I've circled out two of these because I'd like to dive into these two to a greater level of detail. And having had some conversations with y'all, I figured these are the two important ones that would be relevant over here. Now let's take a look at trustworthiness of systems, or trust in general, right? And I position a lot of this work at the intersection of AI and HCI, this new and evolving, exciting space of explainable AI. So what is trust? I guess many of us here have certain interpretations of trust. Do you have any ideas? Can someone say, hey, this is what trust is to me? Any ideas in the room here? By this, yeah, sure.
I feel like if I trust something.
Hang on, I don't think that.
Oh, sorry. I feel like if I trust something, I feel like I don't necessarily need an explanation from it, because I trust that it's making the right decision on my behalf, which I know kind of goes a bit against the explainable AI kind of mantra of using explanations to try and cultivate trust. But yeah, I feel like if you do trust something, it's because you kind of have faith in it more so than anything else, I guess.
Okay, interesting interpretation of trust. So we've heard from Ed here, who says, well, if I trust something, then I don't need to know more about it, right? It comes from a place of faith. All right. Any other interpretations of trust? Yes.
So in addition to to Edward's explanation, I think trust means that I trust this machine, and then it does. I know that it does. It knows what I want, and also besides of this, and also a trust would be I know that if something happened, I can control it.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent points, right? So both of you, all right, I see that we have another.
I think
addition?
trust is like I believe this model, like the system is perfect or like close to perfect, so it can. It might break down sometimes, but most of the time, or even in critical moments, it will help me to. It will make it will work.
All right. Yeah. So I think all of you are right to some extent, right? In different senses, you are sort of getting to that space where you could articulate what trust is. Let me share one of the definitions that I particularly like, right? And I think it's extremely useful to operationalize this particular definition in the context that we're all playing in, right? The human AI interaction space, human AI decision-making space. And this is a definition that Lee and C came up with back in 2004. Now, the attitude that an agent will help achieve an individual's goals, right? One or two of you spoke about how you could rely on this system to do what you want, right? Or to behave in a fashion that you expect it to, right? So that's hidden in this whole notion of an individual's goals. Is this agent going to help me achieve those goals? But what's pivotal in this definition, and I've underlined that for you all, is the fact that this notion is one that will crop up only in contexts where there's some amount of uncertainty and some amount of vulnerability. Now, in a context where there is no uncertainty and no vulnerability, I'd argue that there is no question of trust manifesting, right? Let's break that down a little bit, and let's use a sort of societal construct of trust that all of us implicitly have and embody and used to live our everyday lives in a seamless fashion. I'll give you an example of something all of us did just to get here from the other building, right? We crossed a couple of streets, didn't we? Now, when you're crossing a street, you're probably looking at the traffic lights, you're using zebra crossings for the most part, jaywalkers, yay. What's essentially happening though is there is some amount of uncertainty here, right? You're not entirely sure whether you're going to get to the other side. Arguable, right? But you're relying on the societal transactional trust that's been built and used to make decisions for time immemorial to do exactly that. You know that there's a car and there are buses there, and you're trusting the folks inside those vehicles not to run you over, right? So there is some amount of vulnerability. What's stopping this person from hitting the gas and running you down? But they don't do that, right? Or you believe that they don't do that. They won't do that. So that's the societal trust that you're sort of working on top of to achieve your task of crossing the road. Now, it's a very similar context in which people operate with AI systems or with AI assistant systems, right? Where there's probably some amount of vulnerability that's attached to the situation. Where, well, if I don't have this AI system or if I don't have this automated advice, I'll have to deal with an exponential amount of data. And I can do that because that's not what humans are great at doing, right? But machines are really great at being able to handle large amounts of data. So maybe that's a space that you'd be willing to get some assistance on, right? So there's a need for it. There's vulnerability because, well, if you rely on the advice that the system's giving you, you might get it wrong. It's probably not a perfect system all the time, right? So it's contexts like those where trust is meaningful. And if you're not studying trust in a context where there's vulnerability, or if you're trying to study trust in a context where there's no vulnerability or no uncertainty, then I'd argue that that's meaningless, right? So something that's food for thought for all of us here who are trying to design studies where there's some amount of human AI interaction and we're trying to understand trust and reliance on systems. So what is trustworthy AI? Now, trust, as we've defined and we're talking about it, does not imply that there's trustworthiness in the system. Let's break that down, right? This might sound like a difficult thing to grasp, but it's not really. Imagine you have a fancy little package, right? And we as humans tend to make sense of the world around us by taking a lot of shortcuts, right? So if you're someone who's interested in cognitive biases and you've come across the cognitive bias codex, you know that there's this gigantic wheel with a zillion biases that we could potentially fall prey to, but we rely on them in effective fashions to make sense of the world around us, right? There's just an information overload from left, right, and center, and you have to, process information selectively. So we do a lot of things at a subconscious level just to make sense of the world, bottom line, right? And a part of that also might lead to assuming a system is trustworthy because of how it looks or how it feels, as opposed to truly understanding whether or not you're trusting it for the right reasons. Now, that's where the notion of trustworthiness is all hidden, right? When a system is trustworthy, then it means it will behave in a fashion that you expect it to, right? But if you trust the system because it looks nice, then that's probably the wrong reason. And then that's the context where you're trusting an untrustworthy system, right? So trust does not imply trustworthiness, but trustworthiness also does not imply trust, right? So these are orthogonal concepts that don't have to coexist. And that's where the notion of warranted and unwarranted trust comes out, right? So warranted trust is a system that's trustworthy for the right reasons, and therefore the trust that is built with users is warranted. Now, if there's a system that looks good or acts good and garners trust from users for the wrong reasons, that's unwarranted trust. So what do we take away from this? The desirable outcomes for us is we want to have warranted trust, and we also want to have warranted distrust, right? It's great to empower users to distrust your system when it needs to be distrusted. That's essentially how you'll reach complementarity, right? In the context of human AI collaboration, this notion of team complementarity is gathering traction for the right reasons, right? You need to know, when should I rely on the system? When's the system better off than I am? When is it better equipped to reach the right outcome than I possibly am, right? So that's warranted trust and warranted distrust. And you don't want to have unwarranted trust. And equally, you don't want to have unwarranted distrust, right? Laying the groundwork for what's to come. Now that we've processed trust, what exactly is trust going to do anyway, right? Trust often has to do with our beliefs, but we aren't just a species that believe. We're also a species that behaves, right? Now, from belief to behave, that's where your trust transforms into reliance. And reliance is something that we tend to do on a regular basis these days, and reliance on AI systems, right? Let me walk you through an example. Let's imagine we're all driving our cars and we have a sat-nav system that's been using data from the cloud, from different sources, to give you live advice on whether or not you should turn right here, turn left there, whatever, right? We've all been in these situations. Now, if you rely on a system to a great extent, and over time it's served you well, you might build what's called an over-reliance as a result of over-trust, right? And thanks to that, you might end up relying on the system when you shouldn't. Imagine the live data doesn't catch the point that the speed limit has changed, you might overspeed in a zone you shouldn't. And equally, if you distrust the system, you might not take advice from the sat-nav system and you might get stuck in traffic, right, when it's recommending an alternative route. So you don't want misuse as a result of overtrust, but you also don't want disuse because the user's then losing out on a potential benefit, right? So how exactly can we get that right? And well, here we're playing around in a scenario that's not all that high stakes, right? Should I turn right or left while you're stuck in traffic for a little longer? But the stakes can quickly change in the outcomes as well, right? And we don't want that. Here's a small example from one of my own experiences last year, right? So I use a Garmin watch. Many of us have, fitness wearables or whatever else that we use. And we see that technology is, seeping into our lives in many ways. And Garmin Insights is one of Garmin's ways of saying, hey, I'm processing all of your data and I'll give you some meaningful things that you can act on, right? And this was probably a week in November. I was probably chasing a deadline, right? things we do as academics. And I had a tough week where I didn't get to sleep much. I slept for about 5 hours a day from Monday to Friday. And I was like, well, let's compensate with sleeping a bit longer on the weekends, right? So I slept for 7 hours a day. And then what Garmin got from that was that, hey, your sleep patterns all kinds of messed up. It's great to be consistent, right? That's the advice that the doctors give you. So what that essentially means is you slept too long on the weekends. You should have stayed, sleeping for 5 hours a day. But luckily for me, I'm not taking this advice for granted, right? But also note, again, this is a small example where I could now stop trusting Garmin insights. Since then, it's quite conceivable to say me is who I am. I'll say this is a terrible algorithm. I'm not going to use it, right? I'll check out the next insight, see whether they're doing better. But we're also in a world where, not everyone's privileged to have the education or the exposure to some of these concepts that we do. And a lot of lay people are encountering, advice from systems that might nudge them towards decisions that are ill thought out, right? Again, there's a very small example, right? Easy to navigate this difficult situation, right? But not every situation will be that. So why exactly do we need to think about trust? Why do we need to talk about trust often? So in this context, I think trust plays a central role in human AI interaction because incorrect levels of trust, as we saw in that example, can cause misuse, abuse, or disuse of AI technology. And one of the things that we can take solace in is the fact that different research communities have studied interpersonal trust for time immemorial, right? We're not the first ones to think about these questions, and different fields have unpacked a lot of complex things here. So what can we learn from such goals that have been studied in interpersonal trust? So why do we attribute trust to each other? For example, I trust Damiano not to just get up and come and slap me like Will Smith did, Chris Rock. Why? Because, well, there's some amount of interpersonal trust that we've built over the years that we've known each other. And what does that do? It allows Damiano and myself, or Danula and myself, to now collaborate on things, right? Our goals are not to build trust in each other. When I woke up this morning, I didn't think, hey, I have to get Damiano's trust no matter what, right? Or I didn't think the same about Danula. But maybe a goal that I could have now is, hey, I have to collaborate with these guys. So it's not a goal to create trust, but we want trust because it makes our life predictable, right? Knowing that Damiano won't get up and come and slap me means I can be at ease, right? And not covered away in a corner waiting to get slapped, right? So that makes your life predictable. That's essentially what you need to think about while designing AI systems. Why is it that you want to make things predictable? Because that allows you to collaborate with people, right? We're a social species. We tend to collaborate and benefit out of those. So when you're thinking about transporting that definition into the context of human AI interaction, obtaining trust in a machine can make it easier to anticipate machine decisions. That's essentially why you want explanations. You want to empower users to understand the system so that they can expect how the system will behave. And understanding how the system will behave will allow you to rely on it in a better fashion, right? So let me re-articulate. And Tim Miller, excellent researcher in the area of social sciences, has synthesized this in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, big shout out to Tim Miller. And it's important for us to remember that the trust that you're trying to elicit is not our end goal, right? Our end goal is to use this trust as a mechanism to facilitate collaboration and predictability of the systems that we're building. Now, with that being said, I'll walk you through a series of some of the works we've done to try and push the envelope towards building better human AI interactions. In this piece of work, we collaborated with a bunch of behavioral economists who have a lot of interesting ways of defining and designing experimental setups, but also very powerful frameworks that can translate and generalize to other contexts, right? So we used what's called ultimatum bargaining game. And I'll talk to you about that and explain it in a little bit. What we're really interested in asking in this question was, in this piece of work, was how does dependence on a decision support system affect the behavior of people, right? Do people rely on those systems, and does that make their lives easier? Are there other people who are indirectly impacted by these systems, right? One of you is particularly interested in a question like those, like that one, sorry. So what's the ultimatum bargaining game? In the ultimatum bargaining game, you have, in the simplest single shot setup, you have two players. One of them's a proposer, the other one's a responder. right? Now, just let's imagine that Mark's quite happy that I'm here today and says, hey, you know what, Vinula and Ujjwal, here's $100 from ADM+S/RMIT. Go do what you will with this tonight. But you guys have to split this, right? And if you manage to agree on the split, you guys can go ahead and enjoy it. But if you disagree, you get nothing. I'll take this $100 back and be on my way, right? That's essentially the ultimatum bargaining game. There's an endowment. The proposer now has the right to make an offer to the responder. If the proposer makes an offer, the responder agrees, there's an accept, both get the share. Reject, both get nothing. Simple context, right? Now we use that context because that's a very simple context that can generalize to other areas where there's bargaining involved. And we ran a series of interactions between humans. And using those interactions, we trained a model that could then advise a proposer in a similar context, right? And we tried to see in an incremental experimental fashion how exactly introducing this support system would influence the bargains that were being made in the interactions in the human behavior, right? And then we added another layer of explanations on top of this algorithmic decision support system and tried to observe what that would do. Long story short, and I'll encourage you to take a look at the paper, we found that the perceptions of fairness changed due to the introduction of the ADM system in this human decision-making context, right? So people just thought, now that you've introduced this new autonomous decision support system, that, oh, it's not all that fair anymore. A responder who is trying to strike a bargain with the proposer felt that this was not all that fair, or there were notions of fairness changing because of this. We also found that adding explanations is an additional layer. So a better understanding of the ADM system increased cooperation among people, right? Food for thought. We went a step further and we tried to explore the space of decision-making even further because, well, nowadays we see that AI is being used in contexts like hiring decisions, automated pricing, all kinds of interesting contexts, right? And again, we wanted to use this lens of the ultimatum bargaining game, but used other interesting ways of eliciting beliefs from people. I'll explain this in a little bit. And we wanted to see, well, what's the effect of AI systems in human behavior in economic bargaining environments, right? In places, in things like trade auctions or wage negotiations where there's a fair bit of bargaining to do, what's the role that algorithmic assistance can actually play? Now, when we're building and proliferating systems like these, we often operate on two assumptions. Two important assumptions that get swept on the rug that I want to pull out today, right? One of those assumptions, and I'll call it a condition here, is for people to benefit from AI systems that you're building, you assume that people do not actively avoid the systems. Now, how good is an AI system that is absolutely robust and accurate for the most point if I do not rely on it, right? It's just sitting there. I don't want to rely on it because I don't trust it or because I don't like it or whatever else. It's no good, right? But we're assuming that people will like it. How good is that assumption? The other condition is that AI systems should not or do not systematically err on predicting human choices, right? And quite often we build systems without truly exploring these two conditions. And we said, well, let's try and understand that space a little bit, right? And in some of our work that was published last year at CHI, we explored this question again using this ultimatum bargaining game. Just to give you a sneak peek, I'll tell you what we did in there, right? So we had a means to use the same setup again, the ultimatum bargaining game, but we used a sophisticated way to elicit beliefs from the human players. And in this context, we had responders who could choose whom they wanted to interact with, right? Do you want to get an offer from a proposer who's a human? Do you want to get an offer from a proposer who's a human aided with an AI system? Or do you want to get an offer from a proposer who is represented by an autonomous system on his behalf, right? And we explored what came out of that. So one of our key findings was that responders preferred to approach human proposers, right? And this was despite the fact that it was evident that engaging in bargains with an AI system or an AI system supporting the proposer would be far more beneficial, right? They could have more to gain economically if they relied on the alternatives. And this was obvious in their beliefs as well that we elicited. So they said, we know we can earn more, but we don't want to. We'd rather rely on the human proposer, right? Very interesting. And there were cases, don't get me wrong, this wasn't consistent. There were cases where there were responders who did interact with the autonomous systems or the humans aided by the autonomous systems, but they wanted to get a greater share to succeed on those transactions, right? So those who wanted to interact with the autonomous system demanded larger shares of the pie. Interesting observations. Now, all of this is, again, in that context of to what extent do you trust systems? How do you then behave based on that trust? So what is your reliance like? And one of the difficult things to do, and this is really where the community is now, scratching our collective heads, is how do we articulate and design mechanisms to propagate appropriate reliance, right? Appropriate reliance is relying on the system when the system is potentially right, relying on yourself and not relying on the system rather when it's potentially incorrect. Easier said than done, right? Which is why explanations are being used increasingly, because the hypothesis is that by giving the user or empowering the user to understand the machine decision-making process, we can empower them to figure out when this decision process is probably wonky and should not be relied on, right? Very difficult to get the spot on. And I love this notion that Skimmer et al. Came up with last year, where they said, hey, the sweet spot of appropriate reliance is here when you think about it along the axis of relative positive AI reliance, which is to what extent do you rely on the AI advice as opposed to yourself? And how does that compare to relying on yourself in comparison to the AI advice, right? And the sweet spot is right here, because what this indicates is that you rely on it when it's right, don't rely on it when it's wrong, right? Easier said than done. So what have people been doing in this space? People said, well, what if I tell you how accurate the system is? Will that help? Right? I'll tell you there's a 75% accurate system. Will this improve the way you rely and interact with the system? What if I told you how confident the system is at the instance level when you're trying to make a decision in an informed fashion? Will that help you? What if I tell you how uncertain the system is? Will that help you? What if I gave you explanations? Can this help? Right? And the one common aspect that will underline all of these explorations is the fact that we have mixed results, right? There's no single thing that's out there that'll work for any given context, right? So there's a lot of unclear transferability that is characterizing the space right now. It's also something that we've been exploring a fair bit in some of our recent works. So happy to share that this piece that we were working on for 2 years, after several rejections, finally made it to CSCW. You'll catch it later this October in the US if you're visiting. And one of the ideas we had, and this was something that was born out of this fascinating book I once read called Analogy is the Fuel and Fire for All Reason, right? And in that, the authors were articulating why exactly we as humans tend to think using analogies constantly at different levels, right? And we as educators as well, and many of us can relate to that, tend to use analogies in our classrooms to explain complex things to students and mapping them onto things that we know our students already understand, right? So an analogy is a structural mapping of a target domain onto a domain that you want to clarify, right? So you want to clarify that onto a source domain that you know your recipients are familiar with. And we said, well, what if we took certain things that the common person, and you want to help out lay people with these, right? Experts probably have sufficient knowledge to navigate some of these difficult standpoints or junctures, but lay people probably could use more to rely in a meaningful fashion, because the explanations are quite often single shot. And as I was saying earlier today, explanations are presented to people and then you say, well, good luck. Use the explanation as you will, and I hope you will succeed, right? Not good enough. We said, what if we could add a layer of analogy on top of that so people understand what this means, right? There are lots of differences across numeracy levels and familiarity with AI and technology. That means people would behave differently with or interpret explanations differently, right? What if you could add a layer of analogies that could tell people a little bit more and allow them to act on the explanation, right? So what if I was to tell you that, because I assume that you understand how regular one of your trains is that you're taking every day, and if I knew that, could I transport an analogy onto that and say, hey, this system's as accurate as this train that you know really well and how punctual this train is that you've been taking every day every week for several years, right? Because now you attach this sense of familiarity, this domain that you've been playing in, and you can sort of transfer that onto how you want to interact with the system, right? So we explore certain things in that. Lots of caveats as well. As you can imagine, there's lots of individual dispositions that can affect the effectiveness of analogies in general. But we also wanted to explore how you can generate analogies, right? Because we had enough evidence to say, well, this is good. People tend to benefit from analogies, but under certain contexts, the analogies have to be things that they're familiar with or they can actually relate to. And we said, well, how can we generate analogies? And what exactly is a good quality analogy anyway? Right? And that's something that we explored in this piece of work that was presented at HComp last year, won an award. And I'll walk you through with an example, right? And I think concept level explanations are one of the most common explanations that are being used today. For those of you who have been playing around in the computer vision domain, you probably recognize the lines and SHAP sort of methods where you can highlight certain areas, regions of images and assign concept labels to them and help users interpret these labels, right? Now, let's take this concept level explanation where you've highlighted in a textual task. The concept level explanations are often feature attribution methods, right? And you highlight those key terms that have led to this prediction. And over here, the target sentence is with cribriform and fused glans and needle core biopsy from prostate. This is diagnosed as being the adenocarcinoma of the prostate, right? All kinds of Greek and Latin for people who are not familiar with the field. But imagine you want to explain this to a layperson who lacks the scientific background to really process why this decision has been made or why this prediction has been made, and to what extent this is a reliable diagnosis. And you can use an analogy there and say, well, cribriform and fused glans in a needle core biopsy is definitely a sign of prostate cancer. It's like recognizing a unicorn due to the horn on its head, right? Now, a layperson doesn't know anything about the cancers, but can probably attribute confidence in recognizing a unicorn because of the horn, that they're familiar with that territory, right? And they can probably say, hey, all right, this is probably a right diagnosis, right? I can attribute some amount of transferable confidence from this domain to the other. Again, lots of caveats. What's a high quality analogy? Please do refer to the paper. We tried to synthesize a lot of different dimensions and articulate how to generate these analogies as well using human computation workflows. And we're now trying to work on generating these automatically. But let me give you an analogy to explain our idea a little further, right? Now, I would argue that for the most part, most of these explanation methods that are being developed and propagated these days are focusing on experts. Important, right? But maybe that's only the tip of the iceberg. As you can look around you and understand and imagine how lay people are probably the greatest demographic that are getting affected by AI systems that are being propagated, it's important to also think about that user group, right? Now, experts have their expert knowledge, and they can use these concept level explanations, which some can argue variants of which are state of the art today. They can use that, get onto that ship of expert knowledge, get across their concept level explanation, and reach appropriate reliance and build appropriate trust. What about lay people? Can they rely equally well on these explanations? Perhaps not, overwhelmingly not, if you look at some of the evidence from other studies. Lay people don't have this beautiful little ship or a sailboat to get on. All they have are a pair of shoes. But what we intend to do is build a bridge across this river that lay people can get in their shoes on and still get across the bridge, right, onto the space of appropriate trust and reliance. That's the idea. Now, there are a lot of other things that can shape how trust evolves when people are interacting with AI systems. One of the critiques that I have, and my pet peeve in this space, is people often look at it from the standpoint of a single human interacting with a single system in a single decision-making context. But we as humans tend to make decisions not in that fashion, right? We tend to, if I want to buy a property, I'm not just looking at this automated system that is advising me. Probably going to also interact with my friends. I'm probably going to look at a competing system that's giving me more advice, or I'm probably going to build trust over time, right? It's not a single interaction that builds trust. So you have to look at that in a temporal fashion. Otherwise, it's limiting. It's valuable because you understand a lot of things, but it's still limiting, right? It's not highly ecologically valid because that's not essentially what's happening on a regular basis in the real world. So we've explored some of these things, how do multiple interactions affect trust formation and reliance. There was overwhelming evidence in the past from different fields that showed how important first impressions of systems are. But we also found in our work that it's possible to recover from a trust that's lost. And there are different ways. I'll be happy to talk about this later if that interests you. We've also looked at the role of explanation modalities, right? How do you present explanations to people? Which modality do you pick? Are you choosing graphical representations of explanations? Are you using textual explanations? Are you using voice modalities? How does this affect explanation consumption and understanding? These are usually design choices that people just make because, hey, we're more keen on how well the fidelity of our explanation as opposed to how well people can understand the explanation, right? What about AI system metaphors and anthropomorphism, right? In some of our work published at Kai last year, we were talking about how you can use metaphorical representations of agents in order to impart certain expectations. Now, if I was to tell you that, hey, this is an AI system and I'm calling it a toddler, you'll rely on it differently as in comparison to an AI system that I would present to you and compare with the metaphor of a trained professional, right? So you have a way to shape expectations of people, and that can help them rely on AI systems in improved fashions, right? How exactly can conversational interfaces play a role there, right? Humans tend to interact with each other using conversations day in and day out. And that's just a domain of familiarity that people tend to associate more levels of trust with. Lots to say about all of these things, but just want to give you a high-level view over some of the things we've been doing. And maybe the last thought that I'll leave you with is cognitive biases, right? We've studied cognitive biases in a lot of different contexts. I know many of us here also are quite interested in the information retrieval setup, right? And one could also argue that there are a lot of junctures of decision making in that broad paradigm, which is also now quickly evolving into spaces of conversational search, right? And much like in any other context, cognitive biases play a role, and more so, I would argue, in a context where you're trying to take advice from an AI system. So what we did was we tried to explore whether or not the Dunning-Kruger effect would play a role. No brainer to say yes, it did. But what's interesting is, that this also goes to shape interactions and outcomes differently for different groups of people, right? So we can't treat all individuals in the same fashion. I'll be happy to talk about this further as well. What we essentially saw and observed was that if you overestimate your competence in a task that you're trying to accomplish, along with the opportunity of relying on an AI system that can assist you, if you overestimate your competence, there's a good chance you're going to under-rely on the system, and the task outcome is probably going to be poorer than it could have been, and fall short of having that ideal complementarity in that human AI collaboration, right? So it's important to also think about how to mitigate cognitive biases from shaping those interactions. I'll just skip through this because I sense that I'm running out of time. What are our takeaways? I sort of articulated this to an extent already, but what we did in our work was we studied whether or not tutorial interventions in such decision-making contexts can help empower people to become more critical of the systems and therefore rely on them more appropriately. We found that tutorial interventions can indeed calibrate user self-assessments, especially when they're overestimating themselves. But what it can also do is it can make you a little critical to an extent where you just stop relying on the system a little bit, right? So now, as opposed to over-reliance, under-reliance, which was present earlier on, or over-reliance, which was present earlier on, now people start under-relying on it as well, right? So either there's always a trade-off that's apparently associated with this. We also found that, our assessment of the situation was that a tutorial that's more effective is probably one that helps users to understand themselves better alongside understanding the AI systems better, right? For the most part, people are always focusing on, let's explain this AI system better, right? What can I do to improve the understanding of the user of the AI system? But a user should also know about the user's own shortcomings, and that can improve complementarity in the human AI collaboration. right? Equally important. So I think this is my last slide. And this is, I think, a collection of some of the things that I think are grand goals that we need to overcome as we try to push the envelope towards appropriate reliance. And this is essentially the decision-making space when we're designing a lot of studies in empirical human-centered AI studies that we could go quite wrong, right? So what affects the ecological validity of some of the empirical studies that we're witnessing around us? A lot of times we have to make design choices around the tasks and the scenarios that we're picking and choosing, and that can influence what we find. And now Tom, Dick, and Harry can find one thing, Lucy, Susan, and someone else will find something else. How do I know that these findings compare to each other? How can I transfer a set of findings into contexts that haven't been explored before? Very difficult to do because of the nature of empirical rigorous science, right? What about stakes, right? People often say, well, this is a high stakes domain. I'll just, for the sake of rigor, I'll also pick a low stakes domain. I'll compare these two, beautiful plots, reviewers happy, accepted paper. What about progressive science, right? We don't really know whether this calibration of a high stake is any different from another calibration of high stake. How do I know that a low stake task in one paper is equally low in another paper, right? Quite difficult to do, important nonetheless, right? What about trust measurement? I already spoke a little bit about this. People often isolate trust and measurements and models of trust in single interactions. I think we need to look at this from a temporal standpoint, right? How can we model trust that is not coming from a 1:1 interaction, but an n:n interaction, where it's not just it's not a one human versus one AI system. Maybe it's many humans with many AI systems. Very complex to study, very important to study, right? Maybe that's where the real science is. And individual differences, right? There are a plethora of confounds when it comes to domain knowledge, familiarity. How do you control for all of these factors? How do you understand, and what about generalizability in that space? What about expertise? What about lay people, right? And I said at the start of my talk that we're trying to look at building effective human AI decision-making for everyone. Now, what does everyone mean in context of empirical work? Are we truly focusing on samples that go beyond the weird acronym, right? So Western, educated, industrialized, rich Democrats, right? Are we looking at everyone or are we not? Right, so these are some of the things that we can think about as we try to move ahead. I had a few tips. I don't know whether you would like me to conclude quickly, but I'm also happy to just go a couple of minutes longer to share some of our findings that resonate with some of the prior work in the field that talk about this. I said this before, but when you're designing experiments, I think it's extremely important to make sure you're operationalizing some amount of vulnerability, because in the context where there's no vulnerability for the user, there's no question of trust. Right? And it's also important to manipulate trustworthiness of the system, because the systems that we're going to build and deploy are never going to be absolutely accurate. Right? If it is an absolutely accurate system, there's no context of appropriate reliance, just relying all the time. Right? So it's important to manipulate trustworthiness as well. You need to have experiments that manipulate trustworthiness if you really want to study something meaningful. So we know that this is the state of the art of measuring trust, right there on your screens, right? You have subjective ratings, you have qualitative interviews, you have questionnaires, but when you use those subjective qualitative methods alone, you're only going to get, at best, a little noisy, assessment. But to be more sure about what you're measuring, I would say you should always accompany that measurement with a reliance or behavior-based measurement, right? But also remember and acknowledge the fact that there's always a gap between trusting beliefs and trusting behavior, right? You might tell me I trust this AI system, and then I ask you to interact with it. You might not behave in a fashion that exemplifies the trust you believe you have, right? What else? Some of the other guidelines we learned: use tasks that correspond to clearly measurable performance, right? If you add another layer where there's subjectivity to what is good performance, then a noisy measure gets noisier, right? So at least when you're trying to study these things, pick tasks where it's obvious what good performance means, right? Ensure there's some amount of vulnerability to risks. And there are clever ways of doing this. It's not that it's this hard task that cannot be done, right? You just need to be creative about it. have to think about how can I incentivize or use rewards or different pricing schemes that will make people behave in a fashion that they actually would if they were to encounter this context in the real world, right? So it takes thought, a lot of creativity sometimes, but it can be done. And it's critical that you do that, right? Because otherwise you're not using an ecologically valid experiment anymore. Use reliance at least as one of the measures of trust and manipulate trustworthiness. These are the takeaways, right? Now, I did say you should hold that thought at the back of your heads. I said Sisyphean was constantly rolling this boulder, Sisyphus rather, was constantly rolling this boulder up the hill and back down. And in general jargon, when we use the analogy or the metaphor of a task being a Sisyphean task, you're trying to attribute that this is a difficult, laborious task, but quite often you're also saying this is a futile task, right? But I would argue that as laborious as the process of getting this right might seem to be, it's an extremely important one, and we might be able to build little by little through small amounts of progress one at a time, but it's by no means futile, right? Because I think this is an important area that we need to crack if we really want to create a world where people can benefit from interacting with AI systems. You want to amplify human abilities. If you want to do all those grand things and achieve those things, you need to be able to crack this difficult notion of how can I foster appropriate reliance, right? So Sisyphean task, perhaps, but not futile, right? And with that, I'll end here. I'll be happy to take some questions. Or have I answered all of your questions? Yes.
We will just note we have to be out of this space by 5, so perhaps a few questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. I might be slightly incorrect, but a lot of the examples you gave about cultivating and creating trust in systems didn't really rely on explanations. They relied on past experiences and then having successes, and then those successes kind of lead. So the example you gave was like crossing the road. The reason that I feel safe crossing the road is because I've crossed it a million times and I've not been hit by a car.
Correct.
Yeah.
So
how you're trying to use explanations as kind of like a way to kind of accelerate, not really cultivate trust, but accelerate the process of creating trust in the first place, because you're still kind of relying on people's experience of an AI to kind of get that trust in the first place.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
So
is that kind of, sorry, I just wonder if you have any sort of thoughts on that. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great question. I don't think we want to, our aim is to build explanations as a means to, facilitate trust per se. I think explanations can be used as a means to improve the understanding of the system. And if a better understanding of the system can lead to increased trust, then so be it. That's warranted trust, right? So the point of explanations, if the point of your explanations is to increase trust, that's a terrible metric, right? It's great if your explanations reveal a finer understanding of the system or facilitate a finer understanding of the system, right? I think that's the standpoint, right? And you made another point, and I had a thought in my mind which I've lost now. But does this answer your question?
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
Yeah, but if you have a follow-up, please feel free to.
Yeah, I will do.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have another question. I can ask 2, but I know we don't have a lot of time. My other point was like, at what point do we feel like we have an appropriate amount of trust in a system?
Yeah. So I remember the other point you were making.
Oh,
sorry. Let me hold on
cool.
to that. So yeah, you spoke about experiences. I do agree that that's extremely important, right? That's how we operate in the real world, which is essentially a point I was trying to make earlier on when I said people tend to build trust on systems not on single interactions, but over time.
Yeah.
Right. And I agree with what you're saying, and I think that's how we need to study this. Whether or not you're using explanations to help people understand the system better is another question. But irrespective of that, the notion of trust is something that we know forms over time across experiences, right? And even in human-centered AI studies, often some of the design choices we need to make are along the lines of, okay, should I show the user an imperfect system first, right? Because that biases your behavior. If you were crossing the road and you got hit by a car, hope that'll never happen. You'd probably think twice, as you said, right? So your experience shapes how you will behave with the system later on. So agree with you 100%.
Give someone else a chance.
So my question is about, so thank you very much for the talk, by the way. My question is about how an organization trusts a system. So I'm watching RMIT trying to decide how to trust ChatGPT. And so what it's currently doing is it's getting professors and various erudite people to write explainers about what's going on. You know, this is what it is. You know, and I think the next thing, but what I'm realizing actually is in many ways well, I was wondering what you thought. I'm wondering whether that's not really a way of trusting. It's just a way of understanding, and it's sort of trying to set some boundaries, you know, and it's really trying to understand our fear that the students are going to screw us all on the assessments, and so on. And it's a discussion I had with someone else today was that what we should do is just get everybody. My portfolio is mostly about research, so let's get some PhD students in the room, let's get some professors in the room, and let's just say no, there's no judgment here. Tell us how you're using it. Let's understand what you're doing, and then maybe let's try and understand whether that's perfectly fine or whether we set some boundaries around that. But the interesting thing for me is, as I said, this organization and most organizations right now are trying to decide how to trust an AI system, and it's interesting to watch. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I woke up to an email yesterday that I shared with Garrett, where similarly is what's happening here in RMIT. TU Delft is trying to get a hang of the situation, and again, it's obviously trying to pull together professors and people who are faculty members who are doing things in this regard, and very similar. So I think there are different ways to approach that question, right? One of it, and again, I had a very meaningful conversation with a colleague yesterday, and we started talking about different schools of thought from the standpoint of ethics that can articulate how you would look at organizational trust in different ways. If you come from the school of virtue ethics, right, where the right thing to do should be what you do, then you'd say, well, now what is that? A philosophical question almost. What's the right thing to do? Should students be able to use tools at their behest to succeed in a learning objective? Then your question is, well, as long as the learning objective is served, let the students use whatever, right? Because you as an educator, unless the learning objective is one that's getting hampered by the use of technology or whatever else, there's no reason for us to shout out about it, right? So I think I would actually, I don't think I have a perfect answer for this. I don't think I have a answer that gets anywhere close to being an answer. But I would say, from my understanding of this space, leaning on ethics is an interesting way to do it, because there are different schools of ethics. There's deontological ethics, there's virtue ethics, and there's another category of ethics that doesn't come to mind. And these schools of thought will allow you to articulate different outcomes and look at the same thing differently, right?
Very quickly.
And while you're doing that, just to add to that, I think there's this other school where you'd also like to say, what does the majority think, right? And there's also a space where policymakers sort of come in, right?
So actually, what I was going to say, but really, I value this conversation because you're making me think. I actually think the reason why I was having this chat with someone earlier today is that one of the problems, for example, with this AI system is, before we get to a point of trust, we don't actually understand what it's useful for. And so for example, my wife, I was going about my wife. My wife's a school teacher. At her school, now she's heard me go on about this, and she got very worried the other day that a student was using ChatGPT to produce this university level essay. She's an English teacher. And we spent last weekend trying to replicate that with ChatGPT. And I actually suspect that ChatGPT is completely incapable of doing that level of interpretation, that level of connection. And it's just, this kid is smart. So actually, so actually, before you get to the trust bit, you've actually got to understand what it's being used for.
Correct.
And I'm beginning to realize that that's perhaps what this organization hasn't quite got its handle on. So it's getting the erudite professors to say, oh, it's one of these large language models, and it's stochastic parrots and blah blah blah. But actually, you would need to understand actually what it's being used for, actually what it's good for, what it's not good for, and then you need to start defining. I think that's part of that process is actually before you get to the trust bit. I think you need to understand the capability bit.
Absolutely, and I couldn't have said it better myself, right? And that's perhaps the role of explanations again, where well, people are scratching their heads when it comes to trying to explain, pre-trained language models or large language models in meaningful fashions for very good reasons, right? It's stochastic parrots they are, and it's hard to predict or explain exactly what they're capable of doing until human creativity can use them in different ways that can then tell us more about it, right? Which is why at the start, in the way I position some of the work we're doing, I also say, perhaps the best way to study how we can build better human AI interactions is to study how humans are interacting with the AI, which is essentially what you're saying over here, right? Let's observe and allow students, or in fact support students with asking them to use ChatGPT, and that might create this giant bag of all possibilities that will allow you to then move a step further, try to build and there you could probably say, hey, I can build a layer of explanations that can allow us to understand when one of these possibilities is actually relevant given the confines or constraints of a single course or a program, or even at the organization level. So yeah, I think those ideas resonate very well with some of my own. Yeah.